Well, good afternoon, everybody. So I hope you've had a chance to have a good lunch. We are now ready to start the afternoon's proceedings, and I'm going to talk for like a minute or so that people get the message that things have started in here. And meanwhile, the slide behind me will probably change to the name of our next speaker. Who is, I'm delighted to say, is David King from the leading software and systems house Logica, company based in the UK, which recently became part of a Canadian group called CGI. I'm sure that David will say a little bit more about that. But actually, I used to live in an apartment that was next door to Logica's headquarters. Rather a grey modern building, an attractive grey modern building. I'm not quite sure how the architect did that just near Euston Station in London. So I have, so it's a name that's always familiar to me, but not perhaps for the reasons that most of the rest of us have. So what I'd like to do now is to hand over to David to give us his presentation on what the cloud has to do with fixing the economy, which is certainly pertinent to many of the discussions we've been having today and will have for the rest of the Congress.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for being here this afternoon, the invitation to be here, and thank you for getting back after a very good lunch. So you can hear your colleagues still being summoned from there, but I'm sure they will manage it soon. So as an after-lunch topic, managing the cloud to improve the economy. That's a bit of a tall order in many ways. Do we think that the cloud does actually have a role in fixing the situation that in many, many countries we find ourselves in? It won't surprise you to know I'm something of an optimist about this. I probably wouldn't be doing the job I am if I weren't. But I think in a very fundamental way, there are things where the technologies that we're deploying will actually help economies to accelerate, markets to grow. And I'd just like to spend 20 minutes giving you some background on why I think that, and then some examples of how that's happened, both from our own company and from others as well. And as said in the introduction, we're now an organisation that spans North America and Europe, about 70,000 people, around about slightly more than half of that in Europe, slightly less than half of that in North America. We have something like 250 clients on our clouds in Europe, and one of the first Homeland Security accredited clouds in North America. So there are areas where we've moved into this, although I'm always at pains to say, we say that the cloud is growing in the world. It's about 5% or thereabouts of the IT business at the moment. It'll probably be a lot more than that by 2015. It could well be 30%. But it means you mustn't forget the other 95%, and we'll come back to that from time to time as we go on. So, does it have a role? And the answer is yes, to an extent, because it's already got there. And I'm going to be very loose about what I call clouds at the moment. We'll get a bit more precise later on. But for almost all of us that worked technically in this industry, when you said there was a computer here and a server here, and you drew something a bit fuzzy in the middle to join them up and said, well, they connect via the internet. That was how the cloud was born. It was a pictorial thing that described the internet. And the internet already has made a big difference and taken a big role in the economies of most developed nations. It's more than a fifth of the GDP growth since 2007. And I think the important thing about that is the next line on there. It's not about growth in the IT industry per se. In fact, that's a difficult message for the IT industry quite often, because what is happening with the cloud is we are at last getting round to doing things that we've done to every other industry over many, many years: automate it, reduce costs, and so on. So that means that moving to the cloud is a difficult transition for the IT world, but it's got a huge benefit to other industries. You look at the music industry, more than half of its sales are now effectively in the cloud, their digital revenue. But that's kind of close, isn't it, to being a technology world, although it's got very much artistic flavour. You feel that music is somehow digital rather than mechanical already. I was talking to a wine merchant last week. They, last year, put themselves online to sell wine. Their sales increased by 20%, and they've had to build a new cellar as a result of that. So that's a very non-IT industry, very traditional. Markets are working so that they take up the majority of the improvements, and whereas IT undoubtedly does reduce jobs, it generates nearly 3 for every job that it changes. So the internet has already taken this place in our lives. So what's the cloud going to do more? So my point is that the cloud really is the internet's unfinished business. The internet is very good at connecting everything up. That's what it set out to do. It does it well. The next stage of that evolution is putting services inside the internet to do useful things with that connection and pay for those as we use them. That's really what the cloud is. It's accessing services like that. And if you sort of summarized what clouds are about, they connect all of those stakeholders together, and they kind of do these things. They let you reach new markets. It's cheaper than it used to be. It's affordable. If I'm a small company, I can now use the services that really only big companies used to be able to afford before. If you use any of the online photographic albums, for instance, you'll find many of them now come with facial recognition to catalogue your library of photographs. It's astonishingly good. This is stuff that we used to sell a few years ago for very, very large sums of money to security agencies, and it's now available free to any consumer that wants to use it. Cloud is democratizing the use of technology, and that helps small businesses and consumers a lot. And it's one technology. You can connect to anything, anywhere, and it tends to promote a vibrant international marketplace. So if that all sounds familiar, the interesting thing is that if you rolled your mind back about 150 years ago, the cloud was made of something very different. It was a set of railway lines and engines that connected things together. And it did all of those things I just said on the previous page. And if you think about some of the things that the railways did, it did things like let farmers get their produce to cities far away and sell them effectively. Cities didn't have to grow their own food. That connectivity was fabulous. It let the urban economy grow. It allowed cities to build. It increased productivity for coal, for iron. In the first instance, the railways actually used half of the iron it carried just to build the railway. But after that, it grew manufacturing because it was connecting everything up. And what it did was it made it easier to do things with somebody else than to do it yourself. It was easier to get food from somebody over here to my city than try and grow it locally. And when people find that it's easier to do something with somebody else than themselves, they trade. And when you get trading happening, then you've got the foundations for solid economic growth. So I won't push this analogy too far, it can keep on popping up, but I think you can see the cloud could be that railway of the 21st century. The railways did a phenomenal number of things. What's happening now? Well, look at what Amazon's doing. If the railways connected things up in that way, you've all bought stuff on Amazon. I'd be astonished if anybody hadn't, or at least touched the site. But what's interesting there isn't that they're a good retailer, which they are, but it's all the other retailers in there as well. When you buy something or look at something in that Amazon environment, you get offered something else that might be of use to you. And it hasn't just come from them, it's come from all those other retailers that are present in Amazon Marketplace, thousands of them. And that's doing two things. It gives you and me a much better service because we find things that we know we were looking for, and we also find things that we didn't know we were looking for because we're being given good offers. But for all those retailers in there, they're rising on the incoming tide of greater market interaction. And the thing that's underpinning that is the shared knowledge about what you're buying, coupled with a very good cloud platform. Retailers don't go onto that platform because it's a good, cheap way of getting a web service for retailing quickly. Arguably it is. They go on there because of the recommendations. They go there because they're taken to customers. So A platform like that creates growth for the whole market. And the fact that it's in the cloud makes it possible to deploy it to small and large organizations extremely quickly. So let's come to what the cloud is all about in many ways and stuff that you're familiar with. I won't dwell on it. But we tend to think of it as being lower cost. It is. It's about 25–30% cheaper, and it's faster. It's more affordable in the long term than technology. That lets companies put money into other things, like growing their markets, rather than sinking it into IT, which is good. More importantly, it's also quicker, in the sense that projects are faster, it's more nimble, you can set up a new service quickly. If you're a bank, you can set up a new branch in a new country, as far as the IT is concerned, in a matter of days, rather than, oh, this project is delayed because the IT is taking longer. Suddenly the stuff's working. And that lets companies innovate more. It lets them experiment, try out new services. If they don't work as well as they might have done, then they can withdraw from them and try something else without having spent too much money. If they do work, media companies find this a lot with television series. They create an accompanying website. If the series is successful, they can increase the capacity like that in order to serve, rather than having to have spent all the money to get that platform in place, uncertain of whether it was going to work. So agility is really important for economic growth there. But I think the thing that will actually drive the growth, and the thing that the cloud is good at doing, it's good at sharing hardware to bring the cost down, it's good at sharing software to make things faster, but it's great at sharing information. And that's the Amazon Marketplace effect. That's the railways connecting iron, steel, coal from one place to another. And we see clients being increasingly interested, not in just how to reduce costs, but in how they can get economic advantage in their own value chain, in their ecosystem, by moving to the cloud. So let me give you 2 or 3 examples of what I'm talking about here, because it probably helps to illustrate it. Oil companies have big production platforms. It's a real nuisance to them if they have a fault and the platform has to be taken offline for a while. They lose money through loss of production. The whole field may get affected. And if the damage has occurred catastrophically, then it may take a very long time to fix. However, there is extremely good monitoring equipment available for production platforms in the oil industry. Unsurprisingly, they look at vibrations in drills and all sorts of things like that. If you take that information and put it into a cloud environment, which your partners, your maintenance organizations can share, and they can share the application that gives them access to that information, then they can readily do real-time monitoring of the production platform. They're in a much better position to do preventative maintenance and schedule that, rather than rectify when things have gone wrong. And as you get new equipment, you can bring a new specialist provider on board because it's in the cloud. It takes about a day to get them up and running with it. So you've got sharing of information there. You've got flexibility to extend the ecosystem as you need. And the net result is 2 things. The oil company gets less downtime with their platform, and that's good for them economically. All of those maintenance companies get more business because they're connected very effectively to the people that need it. Looking at a less real-time example, but one that's equally important for that industry. Off the Norwegian coast, there are getting on for 40 or 50 companies that are active in drilling, extracting oil, being the regulators for it, or having some part to play in that ecosystem. There are a lot of joint ventures in there. And those companies need to share information about the regulatory rights they have. Who's allowed to drill where? Who's got the rights to do what in what area? It's quite complex in terms of who's allowed to have access to what information. All of those companies on the screen are now in a cloud-based content management environment. It lets them share all of the regulatory drilling information that they need on a private basis. It's a community cloud, so only those guys are in it. They trust each other. They're not concerned that there's somebody who's just got into that cloud with a credit card that might be undermining what they're doing. So they feel confident, as a result of which they can transact more rapidly. And all the service companies in there get more business by interacting with the oil majors, and the oil majors can move more rapidly. So again, it's a marketplace, effectively, this time for regulatory information. And in the financial sector, there's a similar sort of issue. Major finance companies sell insurance. They don't sell it to you and me directly, they sell it through brokers, typically. And a very frequent issue is that getting the policy information from the insurance company to the broker to the customer to sell it, and then the claim information from the customer back through the broker to the insurance company, can be quite slow and lumpy. That leads to poor customer satisfaction and a whole bunch of things. Fennia, an insurance company in the Nordics, is now in the cloud with their brokers. This means that the policy information is shared between all these people. They can transact, resolve customers' queries about the price of a policy very, very quickly now, sell policies quickly, and when there's a claim, again, it transacts more quickly in the reverse direction. From the broker's point of view, it's a familiar story. They get more business because they work better with Fennia. From the end customer's point of view, customer satisfaction has gone up because that whole ecosystem is working better, which is good. But I think the really interesting point is that that ecosystem is now more flexible. If a broker comes along and says, do you know, I know how to sell insurance really well to young male sports car drivers, because I happen to understand them well, nightmare market, but you know, I can do it. They can be added to that ecosystem technically within a day. So expanding and contracting the range of brokers, either by market or by geography, becomes something that is easily done. If you can do things easily, it's easier to do things with somebody else, then you start to get more of that trading. And we're seeing that time and time again as being an underlying reason why organisations are wanting to move towards the cloud. But it's not just a commercial sector economic benefit, I think. And you can play this story out in practically every sector without much problem. If you look at the engagement of society overall, and a more sort of public sector or government focused way of looking at this, if you just think about what you and I know how to do, to some extent we probably all know a bit of first aid. We'd know how to help somebody if they got injured. Maybe more, maybe less for some of us. In the Netherlands, government there has commissioned a service that's being trialled out, which basically lets that happen. If you're willing, you have an application which is cloud-based, downloaded onto your mobile phone. And you've said, I'm willing to help, I've got some experience in this, I'm happy to be called on. If there's an accident, then the normal emergency call goes to the operator. They can see where the accident's happened because it's being called in by a landline or a mobile phone, gets the geolocation to that. The operator can also see, though, on the right-hand side, where the volunteers are. They select which are the best volunteers for this particular case because they know whether they're nurses or private individuals who've got some experience. And they send a message to those selected people in that area saying, there's an emergency, can you help please? Those volunteers get a map that shows them where they are, where the accident is, and in this case where the defibrillators are on the route because the city happens to have those, so it shows them that. And the overall effect is that lives get saved. But it's sort of more than that. Lives get saved. The emergency services can respond more quickly at better cost, and arguably society feels more engaged. You've actually become part of the ecosystem in doing that. And if you're looking for one thread that is a way that government and citizens can engage using the cloud, happens to be the technology that does it, but processes for doing that, then that's the sort of thing that I'm talking about. But it does take more than the technology. Technology is a great thing for doing these kinds of things. But you'll have heard in the sessions earlier on, and not an unreasonable, ambitious target, I think, being put forward, but there are things that need to be put in place. And the railways found exactly the same thing. They needed similar regulations in order to be able to move goods internationally. They needed trade barriers to be much more straightforward so that steel, iron ore, food could move from one country or one region to another. And look at what's happening now with digital music and cases that are going before the courts to decide whether once I've bought, I think I've bought, or maybe I've licensed some music from one of the digital services, can I actually sell it to you because I've finished with it? I can sell a CD, but can I sell the music? Those sorts of issues, the regulation, the law is arguably running behind the technology, and we need to help that to get to a minimum state where things are more readily traded across the entire environment. There's also a whole raft of issues about trust. Railways again had this, lots of safety issues. Would you trust going on this train? A lot of regulation was put in place to make sure that was right in one set of nations, mostly Europe. A lot of active work was done in the US to make those railroads safe for people. So there are different ways of doing the same thing, but the users need to perceive that the whole service is trustworthy. And from a European perspective, I suspect there is also a note to be played of making sure that we don't have, we've talked about digital natives and the digital have-nots. There is a golden opportunity to divide society as this happens. There's also a golden opportunity to get it right and bring it together by putting the right initiatives in place. And I'm seeing things like European initiatives to get broadband services to more rural areas that will exactly do that kind of thing. Because if you remember earlier on, I said the cloud was all about sharing. Sharing to bring down costs, more agility, share information to get growth. Sharing requires trust. Just think of any time in your childhood when somebody said, I want to share this with you, what you thought about at the time. Basically, is did you trust them to bring it back and not damage it while they were using it? And sharing information requires a surprising amount of trust. The banks, somebody in a bank tells me that as they analyse your transactions, which they do, for all sorts of reasons. This isn't a service being provided by banks at the moment. But interestingly, they can tell to an astonishing degree of accuracy 2 years ahead if you're going to get divorced from the pattern of spending that changes as your life evolves. So I'm not putting that forward as a service at all. What I'm saying is that if you're putting your information somewhere where it might be used by somebody else, you want to be very sure that it's going to be used for safe and trustworthy purposes. And that involves putting together groups of organisations that trust each other, or maybe regulation. And back to that oil company cloud that I had, it was a community cloud. It was a community of oil companies, or the insurance company was a community of financial services companies. They all trusted each other. And I see community clouds meaning groups that have similar values working together rather than the whole European community as being the fundamental way that this will actually build forward. So overall, yes, I think, we're looking for 1% growth out of this. Look at what the internet has already done. I think that's an entirely achievable ambition. It happens through accelerating things. It happens through democratization of technologies so that small companies can use it equally to large. It fundamentally happens through that information sharing. And it does obviously work by sharing information which can have a very strong personal use, which enables this point, I've got about a third on there, serve customers better and spot emerging trends so that you can be ahead of the market. Let me just finish with one small story on that, which is that about 2 or 3 years ago, one of the famous toy companies was stocking up and manufacturing for Christmas. They thought that Buzz Lightyear was the thing that was going to sell extremely well. Lots of films about it. Sold well last year, so surely it would. If they'd been listening to all the social networks, they would have heard the kids and the parents talking about some other toy from that series. And what actually happened was that the pink bear flew off the shelves. Everybody bought the pink bear. They sold out completely. The shops were left with lots of Buzz Lightyears that were discounted. And the message in there is that if there had been a service which scanned the social networks to see what was going on and reported those trends to the toy manufacturing agency, the toy agency would have had more revenue, the customers would have been better served, and the service company that was doing the data analytics on the cloud would have established itself as a very valuable player in that ecosystem. And I think being able to manage the data, interpret it, drive the knowledge economy through sharing it through the cloud is the thing that actually will make the difference going forward. So thank you very much for your time.